Hello, I'm Nick Zachokas, the Student Service Improvement Specialist here at CSI and also the McKinney Vento Liaison for the Charter School Institute. Today is the McKinney Vento New Leader Orientation, and just a little clarification for the training itself. There will be a little speaker in the corner of each slide that will give you kind of the explanation of each slide as you go through it, and so you just click on that and you get the audio throughout. I also included Julia, our grant technician and family school community partner liaison, because she also supports with the McKinney Vento work, and she does a lot of work around the financial side of those things. And we'll have the contact information for both of us at the end of the presentation. I wanted to start off today's presentation with just some quick facts about CSI and our McKinney Vento identification processes. So the first is the number of students identified as homeless students should average 10% of the students who receive free meals. Now that's based on kind of the national average for students who qualify under McKinney Vento is 10% of the students who receive free meals should be identified under McKinney Vento. CSI currently has around 5,000 students eligible for free lunch, and CSI currently has around 100 students identified from year to year under McKinney Vento, which basically means that we're at about 400 students difference than where we should be when it comes to identification. And that puts us in the bottom 5% of identification for homeless. Now, there's a variety of reasons why we have this gap, and there's a lot of things that contributed to this gap. One of the larger ones being transportation. However, we want to continue to improve, and one of the reasons why we're doing these trainings is to make sure that everyone has information around McKinney Vento, understands what it is, and then also knows what to do when they do find out a student will qualify under McKinney Vento. So who qualifies under McKinney Vento? It's any student who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime resident. Now, if any one of those isn't there, the student would qualify under McKinney Vento. When we're thinking about the definition of fixed, it is a residence that is stationary, permanent, and not subject to change. When we think regular, a resident that is used on a nightly basis. And then adequate, a residence that is sufficient for meeting both the physical and psychological needs typically met in home environments. So what are the possible living situations where people would qualify or students would qualify under McKinney Vento? The first one, sharing the houses of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reason. Now this makes up roughly 75% of the students identified under McKinney Vento typically are identified because they are sharing housing with others. And with COVID and the unemployment rate being especially high, we kind of anticipate that this is going to increase moving into this upcoming school year. Another living situation, some other possible living situations, is living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, and campgrounds due to a lack of alternative accommodations, living in emergency or transitional shelters, abandoned hospitals, living in a public or private place not designed for humans to live, or living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, bus or train stations, etc. One of the other common ones that we see for students that qualify under McKinney Vento are youth on their own who lack a fixed, adequate, and regular primary nighttime residence, an unaccompanied youth. Now, often this happens with students that are in high school, possibly living with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and so that's just one of those things to keep in mind. If that is the case, those students do qualify for McKinney Vento and should have access to resources. So sharing the housing of others or doubled up. One thing I do want to highlight is that not all doubled up situations are considered homeless. The key phrase in the example in the definition is sharing the housing of other persons due to the loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. Sometimes families do live doubled up with multiple generations in the family, and those families wouldn't qualify under McKinney Vento. But if people are doubled up because of economic hardships, those are the students and families that need the additional resources. And just kind of to reiterate that, to be eligible for McKinney Vento services, a child or youth living doubled up must have lost or experienced a crisis of some kind. Identification strategies for McKinney Vento. So consider expanding identification parameters outside of just enrollment documentation. Most schools include McKinney Vento enrollment documentation in their initial packets for when students enroll at the beginning of the year. However, what other things are you doing to ensure that students are getting identified in other ways? And then if someone finds out information where students might be doubled up or they're living from their car, how are they getting that information to the right people in order to make sure that those students get the correct resources? So, and who's trained for that? So provide awareness activities for school staff, registrars, office staff, counselors, nurses, teachers, tutors, bus drivers, essentially anybody who connects with students on a regular basis. And as long as they know, or how do we make sure that they know what to do when they find out that information? Because oftentimes people don't realize that if a student is doubled up, that they would qualify under McKinney Vento, and then resources come with that. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to highlight, is that how can we make sure that we're identifying these students and getting the resources out in as many ways possible to make sure that we're identifying these students. And then finally, post outreach materials and posters in areas where there is high traffic within your school. So oftentimes families are uncomfortable talking about this and they only want to talk with certain people around this. So how can we put up posters just so they can get that information, see that information, and then possibly act on that without having a staff member to reach out directly to start the conversation. So I think it's just another way to start the conversation and also to get these students identified and families families the resources that they need. Posters actually will be on the final page, though we have additional resources there where you can just print off the outreach materials. When you're working with families, I just wanted to include some sample questions that you could ask to get a better sense if they would qualify under McKinney Vento or not. These are just some ideas. There's no set in stone way to kind of get at this information, but I just kind of want to highlight a few questions. Is this a permanent arrangement or just temporary? Are you looking for another place to live? Where would you go if you couldn't stay where you are? Okay, so these are just some ideas, some questions that people can ask when you're working with families, when that are struggling or possibly kind of in the middle of residences. And there's also kind of a link there at the bottom that you can click on, and that gives you even more of those questions. The schools who we've seen kind of do the best job of identifying students and getting resources out do a couple of things. We wanted to highlight this. We did a research project. Julia headed up a research project in the spring here of 2020 to kind of focus on how can we make sure that our McKinney Vento resources are getting out to those families, and also how can we improve our identification. So Julia did a ton of work with several of our schools trying to figure out what are kind of best practices and things that we found to help with identification and making sure that we are allocating those resources. So the first is identification efforts. The schools who've identified students consistently from year to year have offered multiple points of contact with families. So multiple staff members in different ways kind of working with those families, and then making sure that all of those school level personnel have been trained around McKinney Vento identification and understanding the law itself and what it means when a student qualifies for McKinney Vento. The other thing they've done is just make sure that they have communication streamlined between their McKinney Vento liaison, the school staff, and the finance department. Sometimes we have seen that students get identified, but then the resources don't necessarily get out to them because there's a lack of communication between the McKinney Vento liaison and the finance department. So if there's open communication between all of those different departments, it ensures that those families that are identified under McKinney Vento do get the resources that they need. Each student that gets identified under McKinney Vento by October count usually will receive right around $200 per student. And the school can use that lump sum of money, depending on how many students they identify, in whatever way they feel is most and best serves the families themselves. So there's a lot of different ways and a lot of flexible ways to use that money. And we'll have a training in the fall around that more specifically, but just to keep in mind that communication between departments is really important. And then finally, when we're thinking about how we connect the resources in our community to these families, what we found is that our staff and our families that are active at the school are often our best resources. So we have those resources at our schools. It's just a matter of figuring out how to leverage them and find them as well, and making sure that we have communication to uh, getting out to our community to make sure that we're leveraging what we have. I did also want to include this safety and needs assessment questions in a remote learning environment. It's just a resource that I wanted to highlight. If we do go back and we're in a remote learning, or if we go, in a hybrid model, I just wanted to include this. It does help teachers and administrators, gives you a list of questions that you can ask in the remote environment to maybe get a better sense of how things are going with the family and the student themselves, and if they do possibly qualify under McKinney Vento. And so this is the additional resource page that was mentioned prior. I just want to highlight a couple of things. If we look at the National Center for Homeless Education free posters, those are the posters that you can post around, print at your school, and then just post them around common areas. Another couple resources, homeless resources by district of residence. It really highlights your community resources and what's around you based on where your district of residence is. So those are the two that are ones that stand out the most. And then we have the CSI page and the CDE page around it, and also Schoolhouse Connection also has a tremendous amount of great resources for McKinney Vento specifically. And finally, this is Julie and I's contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either of us. We're here to help.